June 9th, 1944 at 05:07 hours. 12 miles southwest of Tawi Tawi. USS Harder hangs just below the surface of a warm, black sea, steel skins sweating from the pressure. In the conning tower, it's cramped enough that you can feel every other man breathe. Commander Sam Dealey's hands rest lightly on the periscope grips. His face is pushed into the cold rubber eyepiece, one brown eye staring out at a world that should not exist. Because on this morning, in this tiny slice of ocean, the hunted has become the hunter. For 3 days, the Imperial Japanese Navy has thrown destroyers at this patch of water like a man swatting at a wasp he can't see. In those same 3 days, this single submarine has already sent 3 of those destroyers to the bottom. The official manuals say that is not supposed to happen. Destroyers do 35 knots. A submerged sub does 9, maybe. Between 1941 and early 1944, Japanese destroyers killed 14 American submarines. In a fair fight, both sides actively engaged, no American submarine had ever sunk a Japanese destroyer. Until this boat, until this commander. And he isn't finished. "Up periscope," Dealey says quietly. The metal column rises, dripping out of the well. He lifts it, rotates, and the sea unwraps itself in a slow circle. Horizon, sky, faint morning light, and then, "Contact," he mutters. 3 of them. Column, range, 4,000 yards. He talks more to himself than anyone else. The men in the tower know better than to distract him now. 3 destroyers. Sharp bows knifing through the early swell, masts bristling with antennae. The lead ship throws a long white bow wave, the next 2 trailing behind like wolves. Somewhere in that little pack is the ship whose captain thinks today is the day. He finally kills the destroyer killer submarine that has been humiliating his navy. Somewhere in this steel tube, men are wondering if today is the day their captain finally pushes his luck too far. "Bearing 085, Dealey says. "Angle on the bow. Starboard 20. They're coming." He lets the scope dip. In the tower, the air is hot, stale with sweat and coffee, packed tight with sonar men, plotters, and the helmsman's white-knuckled grip on the diving controls. For a second, Dealey closes his eyes. He is 37. 5 war patrols behind him. 18 ships sank before this current spree. Too many close calls to count. He thinks about April, about the first time he ordered this boat ahead full at a charging destroyer instead of diving away and praying. He thinks about how that one insane decision rewrote the rules of how subs and destroyers fight. Now, with 3 destroyers in his crosshairs and a battle for the Philippines looming, he is about to do it again. Only this time, 2 other Japanese captains will be watching exactly what he does. If he's wrong, Harder will die under a waterfall of depth charges and never be heard from again. If he's right, the Japanese High Command will wake up to a new nightmare. A submarine that doesn't just sink merchants and stragglers, but hunts destroyers. "Stand by forward tubes," he says quietly. "We're going to pick a fight they'll be writing about for a long time." To understand how anyone ends up here, taking a submerged knife to a pack of greyhounds, you have to go back 2 months, to a different destroyer on a different day, when everyone in the Pacific Submarine Force thought Captain Sam Dealey had lost his mind. Until April 1944, every submarine officer in the United States Navy knew one thing as gospel: destroyers were death. The first 3 years of the Pacific War had driven that lesson home in steel and bodies. Destroyers were built to hunt subs. They were fast, agile, carried sonar gear that could hear you breathing, and decks lined with depth-charge racks, K-guns, and guns that could turn a surface submarine into scrap in seconds. If a destroyer got a solid contact on you underwater, your options narrowed to 2: go deep and silent, or die. The Japanese Navy, for all its flaws, had taken anti-submarine warfare seriously. From December 1941 to March 1944, they sank 14 U.S. submarines. Crews learned the names of lost boats like a litany. S-39, Argonaut, Grampus, Wahoo, and more. In that same span, 0 American subs had sunk a Japanese destroyer in a straight, both sides no fight. Boats had torpedoed destroyers, yes. Night surface attacks on oblivious targets. Lucky shots at ships that were busy elsewhere. But never a clean duel where the destroyer came in eyes open and still lost. USS Harder, SS-257, was just another Gato-class submarine in that hard school. Launched in mid-1942, she had the same numbers as her sisters. About 1,500 tons, 300 feet long, 10 torpedo tubes, 4 forward, 6 aft, deck guns topside. Her captain, Samuel David Dealey from Texas, had a face that could pass for a ranch foreman's and a habit of staring a hole through you when you spoke. By early 1944, Harder had 5 successful war patrols behind her and 18 sunken ships on her board, mostly freighters and lesser escorts. Solid record, not legendary. That began to change on April 13, 1944, in the waters of the Celebes Sea. On that morning, Harder found herself in a bad place. Shallow water, poor visibility, and a Japanese Minazuki-class destroyer, Ikazuchi, charging down her bears. At flank speed, bow wave piled high. Periscope depth in those conditions is like standing in the middle of a highway with your eyes 6 inches above the pavement. In the conning tower, officers snapped to the familiar script. Recommend deep dive, sir. Hard right rudder. Take her down and away. Destroyers, you didn't fight. You avoided. Dealey looked at the attack plot, did the math in his head, and said something that made his XOs stare at him. Flank speed ahead. Bring her to meet him. He was going to charge the destroyer. Skipper, if we don't get under him, someone started. Then we die tired, Dealey cut him off. Set up for down the throat. Straight bow shot. 4 fish. Spread 1 degree. Range 900 yards. Down the throat torpedo shots were the stuff of bar stories and gunnery exercises, not operating procedure. You aimed your torpedoes right at an oncoming destroyer's bow and fired while both of you hurtled straight at each other. If you were lucky, a torpedo drilled into the approaching hull. If you were slightly unlucky, the torpedoes missed and ran under or past, and the destroyer thundered over your track and dropped depth charges straight onto your head. There was no second act. At 900 yards, Harder's bow tubes belched 4 Mark 14 torpedoes. Then the boat took a steep down angle as Dealey ordered, "Take her deep, 300 feet." In the violent, groaning descent that followed, everyone on board waited for the roar of the destroyer's props overhead, for the bone-rattling thumps of depth charges. 40 seconds after firing, the world above them exploded. 2 torpedoes hit amidships. Water under pressure doesn't need much of a hole. Ikazuchi blew apart, her boilers and magazines turning steel into shrapnel. She sank within 5 minutes, taking most of her crew with her. Dealey's post-attack report was dry Texan understatement. Expended 4 torpedoes and 1 destroyer. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, chuckled when he read it, half with pride, half with disbelief. In Tokyo, Admiral Toyoda, newly in command of the combined fleet, did not laugh. Between January and May 1944, Japan had already lost 23 destroyers, a bleeding of escorts they could not afford. Toyoda had bigger plans, Operation Ago, a massive counterblow to crush the expected American landings in the Marianas and Philippines. It required intricate timing, tankers, screens, air cov. Every destroyer had a job. Losing one to a submarine that charged it head-on was intolerable. By late May, Toyoda had pulled his mobile fleet together at Tawi Tawi in the Sulu Sea. 4 battleships, including Yamato, 9 carriers, 15 cruisers, and 28 destroyers, the largest concentration of Japanese naval power since Midway. American codebreakers at Pearl read those movements in decrypted signals and felt the hair on the back of their necks stand up. Lockwood's response was simple. If the Japanese were going to mass their might at Tawi Tawi, he would send Harder to the front door. For 9 days in early June 1944, USS Harder stalked the waters around Tawi Tawi like a shadow. Night surface runs, daytime at periscope depth, always watching, always counting silhouettes against the anchored forest of Japanese ships. Underwater, the Sulu Sea felt tight. Tawi Tawi's coves and channels crawled with destroyers, patrol craft, barges, sampans. Above, Japanese patrol planes combed the surface in lazy, predatory arcs. Dealey knew he was sitting next to a hornet's nest. He also knew there was no better place on Earth for a man who liked to swat hornets. For 9 days, luck and skill kept Harder unseen. Then, at 03 Hancock on June 6th, it ran out. A Japanese float plane, prowling the area north of the anchorage, caught Harder's periscope wake with just enough dawn light to see the disturbance. 15 miles north of Tawi Tawi, 3 destroyers were ordered to converge on the contact. Minazuki, Hayanami, and Tanikaze, 1,000 tons of guns and speed apiece, their captains hungry for a submarine kill. At 0647, Harder was trailing along at periscope depth when sonar picked up the unmistakable pattern of multiple fast screws closing. In the conning tower, sweat beaded on every brow despite the early hour. Sound reports 3, maybe 4 high-speed screws. "Bearing 210, sir," the sonarman called. "Range decreasing rapidly." Dealey lifted the periscope and spun slowly. The sea around Harder was silvered by early morning light. Out on the horizon, 3 sharp-nosed shapes cut bow waves across the calm. "Destroyers," he confirmed. "Column, lead ship zigzagging hard. They know we're here." The classic script would have been simple. Go deep, go quiet, and hope the destroyers lost contact before they walked depth charges across his hull. But Dealey hadn't earned the nickname Destroyer Killer by obeying the script. He studied the lead destroyer's dance, Minazuki. 1,250 tons, 4 5-inch guns, swings of her bow, as she wove to cover likely torpedo tracks. Then he gave a quiet order that made at least one junior officer's stomach drop. "Bring us onto her track. Bow on. Range 1,100 yards." The fire control party exchanged glances. Every man in the tower knew what he was about to attempt. Down the throat. Again. Harder's bow swung to face the charging Minazuki. The math on the plotting table began to show an insane geometry. 2 specks in a vast ocean, hurtling straight at each other at a combined closing speed that left seconds for error. Range 1100 yards. Time to collision 96 seconds, the exec read off, voice tight. Dealey's reply was calm. "Standby tubes 1, 2, 3. Set for straight run. 3-second interval. Fire when bearings green." He leaned into the periscope and watched the destroyer grow. Bow wave, cutting crest of white, spray thrown to either side, a flicker of muzzle flashes as Minazuki's gunners fired blindly at the spot where they thought a periscope might be. The bearing dial slid toward 0. "Shoot," he said. 3 Mark 23 torpedoes lunged out of Harder's bow. "Take her down, 300 feet, angle down 30 degrees, all ahead full." As the boat tipped and groaned, everything inside seemed to fall forward. Men grabbed for rails. Coffee cups slid off shelves. A wrench clattered along the deck. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of rushing water over the hull and the creaks of steel adjusting to new stress. Then, 40 seconds after firing, 2 violent explosions hammered through the water. The whole submarine shook like a toy in a giant's hand. Light fixtures shattered. Tools jumped. Gauges blurred. A third, massive detonation, a heartbeat later, kicked Harder's stern up 6 feet, then dropped it with a bang that rattled teeth. In the control room, a few men thought for a sickening instant that they'd been hit, but the pressure hull held. "Hold depth, 295 feet, the diving officer barked, riding the boat with practiced hand on the planes. Up top, Minazuki was dying. When Dealey eased Harder back up to periscope depth minutes later, there was nothing left of the destroyer's proud bow but churning oil and floating debris. The other 2 destroyers, Hayanami and Tanikaze were dumping depth charges in wild patterns nowhere near his actual position, chasing phantoms. At 09:02, news of Minazuki's loss reached Admiral Toyoda's flag at Tawi Tawi. One destroyer, searching for a submarine near his battle fleet, gone in a few minutes, sunk by that same damned harder. Toyoda's jaw clenched. He ordered more destroyers detached from escort duty. 6 of them. Their mission: find that submarine. Kill it. By noon, Japanese patrol planes were making systematic sweeps every 20 minutes, scouring the sea for Harder's periscope. But Sam Dealey wasn't done hunting. He was just getting warmed up. The ocean at 02:30 feels different. Cooler air, quieter sea. Any light from the horizon snuffed out under a heavy black lid of cloud. On June 7, 1944, at 02:30, Harder rode the surface again. Diesel engines throbbed under the deck plates, pushing the boat through ink-black water as she charged batteries and sucked fresh air into her steel lungs. Night like this, one lookout muttered, peering through binoculars at a horizon he couldn't see. You'd have to bump into something to know it's there. At 03:12, the radar operator's voice cut across the bridge like a bell. Contact, bearing 095, range 8,000 yards, speed high, single ship, closing. Dealey stepped out onto the exposed bridge, wind slapping at his face, and took the binoculars from the lookout. He saw nothing yet, but at 28 knots, if the contact held true, they wouldn't have to wait long. Inside the Japanese destroyer Hayanami, Commander Hideo Kuboki was tired enough to feel it in his bones. His ship had been at sea, hunting submarines since 01:00. His sonar men were half numb from trying to distinguish real echoes from the clutter of reef and current. At 03:00, orders came from Tawi Tawi, return to base. He turned his bow home, engines humming, probably thinking about coffee and a few hours' sleep before the next patrol. His radar man called out a small contact at 04:00 position, 4,000 yards, speed high, but wrote it off as another Japanese ship making for anchorage. Nothing in his training suggested an American submarine would be up here, on the surface, picking a fight. On Harder's bridge, Dealey's mind sketched the intercept. "Flank speed," he ordered. "We'll go meet him." The diesels roared. The bow rose on the swell. Harder's speed crept up. 15, 18, 21 knots, near her maximum on the surface. It was a madman's dance, charging a destroyer with your one deck and conning tower exposed, betting you'd get inside his reaction window before his guns or his rudder cut you to pieces. "Range 4,000 yards and closing," the radar man called. "He's still coming, Captain." At 3,000 yards, something finally pinged wrong in Hayanami's radar man's head. "Target small, speed high, bearing steady," he reported. "Not a destroyer, possibly submarine on surface." Kuboki's stomach must have dropped. He ordered flank speed and a turn to ram, a classic destroyer move against a surface sub. But momentum and surprise favor the man already moving in. On Harder, at 2,300 yards, Dealey gave the order. "Open outer doors, tubes 1 through 4. Fire when ready." 4 torpedoes slid into the sea, their wakes invisible in the dark. "Come right. Prepare to dive," Dealey snapped. "We're not going to be here when he passes over." On Hayanami, alarm bells rang. Men ran. Orders flew. There wasn't time. 2 of Harder's fish found steel. They slammed into Hayanami's starboard side near the aft magazine. What followed was not an explosion so much as a violent unmaking. The blast tore the destroyer's stern nearly off. Fire rolled up from her guts into the night. The ship heeled over 90 degrees, props still spinning uselessly in air as she went stern first into the black. Commander Kuboki and 147 of his crew died where they stood, many without ever seeing the submarine that killed them. Harder was already sliding under, diving to get away from the inevitable response. Within minutes, Japanese patrol planes were converging on the patch of ocean where Hayanami had disappeared, dropping flares, peering at the surface for oil and bubbles. They found wreckage and a widening ring of oil. They did not find harder. 2 destroyers in 24 hours. At Tawi Tawi, Admiral Toyoda's fury went from hot to incandescent. Destroyers were the thin skin protecting his carriers and battleships from the American wolf pack. Losing 1 was bad. Losing 2 on consecutive days to the same audacious submarine? Unacceptable. He pulled 8 more destroyers off convoy escort duty and organized them into hunter-killer groups. Every captain got the same order: maximum aggression, no retreat. Kill that submarine. Somewhere so. In the darkness, Sam Dealey read his chart and smiled thinly. If Toyoda wanted to send more destroyers out hunting, Harder would just have to oblige them. On June 8th, Dealey took Harder south, toward a narrow throat of water called Sibutu Passage, between Tawi Tawi and Borneo. If Tawi Tawi was the Japanese fleet's front yard, Sibutu was the side gate every destroyer and escort had to use to come and go. Japanese destroyers patrolled there constantly, sweeping the choke point for submarines, confident in their speed and their ability to box in anything that got too close. Dealey's thinking had a certain Texan simplicity to it. If you want to make a name as a destroyer killer, you go where the destroyers have to be. At 1400 on June 8th, a lookout called from Harder's periscope. 2 ships bearing 310, range about 18,000 yards. Looks like destroyers, Captain, making good speed. Through the scope, Dealey saw them. 2 sleek shapes, bows cutting at around 25 knots, weaving a lazy search pattern across the passage. One was Tanikaze, a veteran destroyer that had seen fights from the Aleutians to the Solomons. The other was a smaller escort, likely operating as backup. For 90 minutes, Harder crept and watched. Destroyers on ASW patrol rarely drove straight. They zigzagged, changing course at set intervals to cover more water, make themselves harder torpedo targets. Tanikaze and her escort were no different. 8 minutes on one heading, turn, 8 on another, turn again. Dealey watched the pattern like a chess player, noting his opponent's preferred openings. Every zig offered him a tiny window at the moment of the turn, 30 seconds where the destroyer would be swinging onto a new course, momentarily predictable before the next leg. He positioned Harder ahead of them, in the path of an anticipated future leg, nose pointed like a man waiting in a dark alley. At 16:30, Tanikaze altered course directly toward his position. "Here she comes," Dealey murmured. "Range 3,000 li." I decided her walk-in. 2,500 yards, 2,000 to 1,500. In the torpedo room, men could almost feel the vibrations of the destroyer's boilers through the hull. At 1,200 yards, he gave the order. Fire 1. 17 seconds. Fire 2. 17 seconds. Fire 3. 17 seconds. Fire 4. 4 eels in the water, space to rake a length of hull. Harder stayed at periscope depth a heartbeat too long, Dealey watching for hits. The first torpedo's white wake slid just ahead of Tanikaze's bow. Too far. Miss. The second slammed into her forward hull near the bridge. The third struck the forward magazine. What happened next seared itself into every Harder crewman's memory. Underwater, with hatches dogged and bulkheads sealed, the explosion's roar was still clearly audible. A deep, gut-felt concussion punched through steel and flesh alike. In the torpedo room, one sailor later said it was like God slammed both fists on the hull at once. Tanikaze's bow section didn't just sink, it detached. The forward third of the ship, from forecastle to bridge, sheared away under the force of the blast, lifting, twisting, and then plunging nose first. The rest of the hull rolled and broke. From first hit to final bubble, it took less than 3 minutes for what had been a proud destroyer to become debris streaked with oil. Her escort reacted with the same instinct every destroyer captain had drilled into him, charged the attack bearing. She turned hard, accelerated straight at the patch of ocean where the torpedo wakes had come from, and began walking depth charges down the suspected line. Dealey took Harder deep this time, 400 feet. Deeper than comfort, flirting with the boat's design limits. Explosions marched above and around them, rattling gauges, cracking paint, popping a few light bulbs. But no rivets popped, no seams opened. The hull held. After 40 minutes of cat and mouse, the escort gave up and withdrew to search for survivors over the wreck of Tanikaze. Harder ghosted away, deeper into the passage's shadows. 3 destroyers in 3 days. In Tawi Tawi's flag plotting room, Admiral Toyoda's staff slid markers off the chart, grim-faced. Each one represent a ship they could not easily replace, and a hole in the screen around their precious carriers. Somewhere in that room, someone must have thought, if one submarine can do this much damage before the battle even starts, what happens when the battle actually begins? Toyoda was about to make decisions that would ripple all the way to the Philippine Sea. But before he did, Sam Dealey had one more destroyer to kill, and this time he was going to do it in broad daylight, with 2 more Japanese destroyers watching. Dawn comes early and bright in the Sulu Sea. On June 9th, at 05:03, Harder eased back up to periscope depth 12 miles southwest of Tawi Tawi, case lid sweating, air stale from a long submerged run. "Upscope," Dealey said. Water streamed down the periscope shaft as it broke the surface. He took a slow full circle. What he saw in the second sweep made him hold his breath, and every man in the tower followed suit when they heard his next words. "Column of 4, bearing 070. Looks like a convoy with escorts. 1 big one, 3 small." At the head of the line, a fat silhouette, likely a tanker or oiler, critical to Toyoda's ability to move his fuel-hungry fleet. Flanking and trailing it, 3 destroyers. This was exactly the kind of formation the Japanese could not afford to lose, not with Operation A-Go about to get underway. It was also the kind of target a sane submarine commander avoided picking apart in full view. 1 destroyer you might get away with in a daylight attack. 2 or 3, alert and on your scent, that was asking to die. Dealey chewed that risk like a man testing gristle. He thought about orders, about the bigger picture. Then he remembered the loss tallies of the last 3 days, on their side and the enemy's. Harder's crew were all volunteers for this patrol. They knew who they were hunting. "I don't think they've seen us yet," he said quietly. "We've got 1 good shot before every tin can in this sea comes sniffing." "Target?" his XO asked. "The oiler," Dealey replied. "You can replace destroyers faster than fuel." He watched the convoys weave, tracking zigzags and relative spacing. The leading destroyer through a shallow V of water in front of the tanker, the wing destroyers sitting about 1,000 yards out on either beam, like guard dogs. He slipped Harder forward and to the side, aiming to cut across the bow of the formation at a shallow angle. "Range to lead destroyer. 5,000 yards and closing," the plotter murmured. The Sulu Sea was clearer here. Light came down in shimmering beams, turning plankton into silver dust. It also made a sub easier to spot if she broached or her periscope wake flashed at the wrong moment. Dealey stayed cautious, popping the scope only for 5-second looks every few minutes. At 06:15, the lead destroyer turned slightly, adjusting the convoy's course. That was the opening. "Range to tanker? 4,000 yards and coming down. Set depth for 10 feet under keel. Salvo 4 torpedoes, 3-second spacing," Dealey ordered. "We're going to cut her legs out from under her." He raised the scope one last time, centered the crosshairs on the fat bow wave beneath the oiler's prow, and gave the command. "Fire. 1, 2, 3, 4. The boat shuddered slightly as each fish left the tubes. This time, he didn't linger. "Take her down. 250 feet. Rig for depth charge." Harder angled down just as the escorting destroyers began to react. On the surface, the destroyer killer earned his name again by killing something other than destroyers. 2 of the 4 torpedoes hit. 1 under the forward tanks, 1 amidships. The Japanese oiler's hull bulged, tore, and began to vent burning fuel into the sea. Fire raced along the slick, turning water into an inferno. Through the hull, even at depth, Harder's crew heard the muffled roar and felt the concussion. In the Gaussian fog of sonar pings, men heard the ping-ping-ping of angry destroyer sonars seeking them. This time the depth charge patterns were tighter. The Japanese captains had seen the bubbles, the wakes, the explosion. They knew roughly where the shot had come from. Charges rolled in from both sides. For the next hour, Harder endured perhaps the most brutal pounding of the patrol. Explosions thumped overhead, some close enough to knock men off their feet and dim the lights. A few valves wept. A seam or two creaked, but the hull kept its integrity. At one point, a charge went off so close that a gauge needle spun and stuck. Someone muttered a prayer. Someone else grinned without humor and said, "They're burning fuel we just took away." Eventually, the destroyers had to choose: keep chasing a ghost with dwindling depth charges, or turn back to the flaming wreck of the oiler to look for survivors and contain the fire. Harder felt the pattern slacken, and Dealey nursed the boat away, using thermal layers and seabed contours to break the last sonar echoes. By late morning, the submarine that had, in 4 days, sunk 3 destroyers and a tanker, and savaged the nerves of every Japanese escort captain within 100 miles, was slipping out of Tawi Tawi's waters. The Japanese couldn't quite believe the reports. An American submarine, sinking destroyers on purpose, picking off escorts and tankers right under the nose of their greatest fleet assembly since Midway. But the men lowering life rafts into oil-slicked water believed it. So did their admiral. USS Harder's 5th Patrol ended the way most legendary patrols do, with ink on paper. In Fremantle, Australia, when Dealey finally brought her in, the patrol report read like something out of a pulp war novel, if a little more restrained. Harder claimed multiple destroyers and escorts sunk or badly damaged, plus an oiler. The intelligence staff pored over dates, positions, and intercepted Japanese traffic. As the bits were cross-checked, the staggering truth emerged. In just 4 days around Tawi Tawi, one U.S. submarine had sunk 3 destroyers outright: Minazuki, Hayanami, Tanikaze. Sunk or fatally crippled a 4th escort, and at least 1 oiler, auxiliary, forced Japanese Admiral Toyoda to divert critical destroyers from convoy and fleet screening just days before the decisive Battle of the Philippine Sea. In Tokyo, the cables told the same story in different language. Reports of lost ships, stunned and defensive. Minazuki lost while prosecuting submarine contact. Hayanami lost in unexpected night surface attack by enemy submarine. Tanikaze lost in Sibutu Passage after sudden torpedo strike. Escort unable to locate enemy. Toyoda saw his already thin destroyer screen being whittled away by an enemy that wasn't behaving properly. Submarines were supposed to be commerce raiders, ambushers of tankers and freighters. They weren't supposed to charge destroyers, fight them at night on the surface, or pick off escorts in broad daylight within sight of a fleet anchorage. He couldn't afford to let one American captain redefine that reality. He pulled together hunter-killer groups. He ordered maximal aggression. He tried to strangle the destroyer killer with the very vessels that were disappearing one by one. He didn't catch Harder on that patrol. The U.S. Navy's reaction was more complex. Within the submarine force, Sam Dealey became a quiet legend. You couldn't tame. Each exactly what he had, an instinct for timing and aggression that let him know just when to ram the spear instead of ducking away. But you could point to his patrol as proof that doctrine could, and maybe should, bend. Harder's Tawi Tawi run came at a moment when the American undersea campaign was already strangling Japanese logistics. Adding destroyer hunter to the submarine job description increased the mental load on Japanese commanders precisely when they could least handle more shocks. Days later, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, scattered and fuel-hungry Japanese forces sailed into the largest carrier clash of the war with fewer screens and tanker options than they'd planned for. You can't say Harder alone won that battle, but you can say she nudged the board in a way the enemy high command had not anticipated. There's a dark coda to the story. On her very next patrol, USS Harder was lost with all hands, likely to a depth charge attack off Luzon. Sam Dealey went down with his boat. Posthumously, he received the Medal of Honor. His citation referenced, among other actions, that 4-day destroyer-killing streak off Tawi Tawi. Today, if you walk through certain naval museums or read the silent service histories, you'll find a nickname attached to Harder in a way almost no other boat shares: Destroyer Killer. The Japanese couldn't believe one U.S. sub could do what she did in that week. Many in the U.S. Navy were almost as surprised. That's the real fuel of this story. Not just tonnage sunk, but how one commander's refusal to be purely defensive under the sea forced both navies to rethink what a submarine could be. If this kind of story hits you, about people in cramped steel tubes rewriting the rules under fire, stick around. There are more boats, more risks, more moments when someone looked at doctrine, looked at reality, and chose reality. Hit like so this one doesn't vanish into the algorithms deep. Subscribe if you want the next patrol to reach you. And if you had family in the silent service or on the destroyers hunting them, drop their stories below. History isn't you. It's the admirals and the big battle names. It's also the men in conning towers who decide at 06:47 on a June morning to turn toward 3 charging destroyers instead of away.